I was sitting in the living room of my mother's house on what was supposed to be just another tense family meeting when I heard the sentence that would seal the end of everything I thought I knew about loyalty. My sister was sitting across from me, her arms folded and a smug smile curling at the edge of her mouth. My fiancé sat beside her deliberately, avoiding my eyes, his body angled toward her as if I were nothing but an inconvenient guest. My mother lounged in her oversized armchair, swirling the ice in her glass with the calm authority she had always used to keep us in line. She looked straight at me and said in a voice so casual it felt like a slap, "Just let him love you both." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating, daring me to react. I felt the heat rise in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I did not flinch. I had learned long ago in this house that emotion was a weapon best kept hidden until the right moment. My sister's eyes glittered with satisfaction, as if she had finally claimed something she had always believed should be hers. My fiancé's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, which in my mind was worse than a confession. My mother took a slow sip as though she had just offered me a perfectly reasonable compromise, instead of an insult so deep it cut through every layer of trust and dignity I had left. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting stripes of light across the rug where I sat. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, each second stretching into an eternity as I kept my gaze locked on my mother's face. They thought I would cry. They thought I would beg. They thought I would collapse under the weight of their betrayal. But what they did not know was that I had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it with a patience they could never imagine. I glanced at my watch, and at the exact time I had planned, the front door opened. The sound of firm footsteps echoed down the hallway. My lawyer stepped into the room, a stack of neatly bound documents in his hand, and closed the door behind him. I smiled, then, not the smile of someone defeated, but the smile of someone who has finally arrived at the day they have been working toward for months. I grew up in a house where the rules were written by my mother and the ink never faded no matter how unfair or damaging they were. My father had died when I was 14, leaving behind a modest inheritance and a mortgage that my mother somehow turned into her personal empire of control. She took charge of everything from finances to family relationships, and she wielded that authority like a scepter. In her world, appearances mattered more than truth, and loyalty was defined as obedience to her wishes. I was the younger daughter born 3 years after my sister Claire. From the earliest days, it was clear to anyone watching that Claire was the favored child. She was given the best clothes, the newest toys, the expensive ballet classes, while I was expected to make do with hand-me-downs and chores that kept me busy when I might have been making friends. When report cards came home, Claire's mediocre grades were met with indulgent smiles and promises of tutors, while my straight A's were brushed aside with a comment about not letting it go to my head. In high school, when I made the varsity soccer team, my mother came to exactly one game and spent the whole time talking to another parent about Claire's upcoming piano recital. She used every opportunity to showcase Claire's charm and social ease while quietly undermining my achievements with faint praise. By the time I was in college, I had learned not to expect fairness or even basic respect from her. Claire drifted through a series of short-lived jobs and relationships, always landing softly because my mother was there to cushion her fall. I worked 2 part-time jobs while studying full-time, and when I graduated, I built a career in project management for a growing design firm in the city. It was there that I met Daniel, the man who would later become my fiancé. He was confident and funny, and he made me feel for the first time like someone was truly on my side. My mother liked him well enough at first, though she quickly began to make small comments comparing him to Claire's boyfriends, as if testing the idea of sharing him in some unspoken way. Claire played her role perfectly, always laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, standing a little too close at family gatherings, brushing his arm as she passed behind his chair. I noticed, but told myself I was imagining it because the alternative was too ugly to face. When Daniel proposed after 3 years together, my mother's smile was polite but not warm. She began steering conversations toward the importance of keeping family ties strong and how marriage was about compromise in ways that sounded oddly rehearsed. Claire congratulated me with a hug that felt staged and an expression that did not reach her eyes. We planned a spring wedding with careful attention to every detail, and I allowed myself to believe for a time that perhaps the past would not repeat itself. But the truth is that old patterns rarely change, and my mother's grip on the family dynamic had not loosened in the slightest. She was still the arbiter of what was acceptable, and she still believed that Claire deserved more, no matter the cost to me. This was the backdrop against which every holiday, every conversation, and every decision in our family was made, and it was why the betrayal that came later cut so deeply. My mother had raised us in a hierarchy where Claire's happiness was the ultimate goal, and my role was to adapt to whatever would keep that intact. Daniel had walked into that arrangement without understanding it, and by the time he realized the weight of its unspoken rules, he had already begun to bend under it. The little moments of favoritism, the lingering looks, the way my mother positioned us in family photos with Claire, always in the center, they were all signals in a language I had spent my life decoding. Looking back, I can see how those signals built a bridge between them long before I discovered the truth. And perhaps the most painful part of all was knowing that in my mother's mind, the events that would shatter my engagement were not a betrayal at all, but simply the natural order she had always enforced. Claire's advantage over me had always been reinforced in 100 subtle ways that most outsiders would have missed, but that I felt like bruises on my skin. At birthdays, she received gifts that reflected thought and expense, while mine were practical items chosen without care. When family friends visited, my mother would introduce Claire as her beautiful eldest daughter with a promising future and then mention me as the younger one who was good with computers, as if I were a helpful household appliance rather than a person. As we grew into adulthood, the gap between us only widened because my mother actively cultivated it. She gave Claire the spare bedroom rent-free when she was between apartments, but charged me above market rent when I needed a place to stay for a few months after college. She praised Claire's social media posts as creative, while dismissing my professional achievements as lucky breaks. The undercurrent was always the same. Claire mattered more, and I should accept my place quietly. That hierarchy did not vanish when Daniel entered my life. At first, he seemed immune to it, laughing off my mother's passive-aggressive remarks and treating me with an open affection that made me think perhaps I had finally found someone who saw me entirely. But slowly, I noticed shifts. Claire would lean across him at dinner to reach for bread when there was plenty within her grasp just to brush against his arm. She would send him playful texts about family jokes or local events without looping me in. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he said I was reading too much into it and reminded me that Claire was just friendly with everyone. My mother's commentary made it worse. She would say things like, "Daniel is such a good sport with Claire," or, "It's nice to see him bring out her fun side." I swallowed my discomfort because I wanted to believe Daniel and I were strong enough to weather the strange currents in my family. Still, there were moments that stayed with me, like the time Claire and Daniel disappeared from the living room during a holiday party and returned together from the kitchen laughing at some private joke, or when I saw him watching her across the table with a smile he rarely gave me anymore. I began to sense a wall building between us brick by brick while my mother stood by holding the mortar. The pattern of exclusion was familiar from my childhood: inside jokes I wasn't part of, decisions made without me, opinions dismissed before they were considered. My mother and Claire would plan family outings and tell me at the last minute, knowing I had work commitments that would keep me away. Daniel began attending some of these without me claiming it was easier than refusing. Each time I protested, my mother accused me of being dramatic, and Claire would roll her eyes as if I were a petulant child. In hindsight, it was all leading to the point where my place in the relationship would be diminished to nothing. The affection that Daniel once showered on me became sporadic, as if he were rationing it. Claire, meanwhile, seemed to thrive in my presence, flaunting her closeness with him in small, calculated ways. My mother's encouragement of this behavior stripped away any pretense that she was neutral. She began to speak openly about how complicated relationships could be, and how important it was to be understanding when men made mistakes. Her advice always seemed aimed at preparing me to accept less than I deserved. It was a slow suffocation, the kind that makes you doubt your instincts until the truth hits you with the force of a storm. By the time the evidence surfaced, the dynamic had been eroding my engagement for months. What made it so insidious was that it mirrored the same control and favoritism I had endured my whole life, only now it threatened not just my sense of self, but my future. In a family built on unbalanced scales, I had always been weighed light and told to be grateful for whatever I was handed. Daniel's shift toward Claire was simply the latest example, and my mother's approval of it was the most painful confirmation of all. It was 1 month before the wedding when the truth emerged in a way I could no longer explain away or soften with wishful thinking. Daniel had been in the shower and his phone was on the nightstand, still lit from a recent message. I had never been the type to check a partner's phone, but the preview on the screen was impossible to ignore. Claire's name flashed above a sentence that made my stomach twist. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. My hands trembled as I unlocked the phone using the code Daniel had given me long ago in the spirit of trust. What I found was not a single careless message, but an entire thread of intimacy spanning months. There were playful texts that became flirtatious, then explicit photos and descriptions that left no room for doubt. They had met in secret more than once, and the tone of their exchanges was not the language of a brief lapse in judgment. It was familiarity. It was a relationship that had grown under my nose. I sat on the edge of the bed reading until the words blurred, and the only thing I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom, I was holding his phone in both hands as if it might burn me. His face drained of color when he saw what was on the screen. He started to speak, but I raised a hand to silence him. I asked only one question. How long? He hesitated just long enough for me to know that the truth would be worse than the lie. He said it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but the timestamps in the messages told me it was many moments strung together into a deliberate choice. I told him to leave, and he did without protest. My first call was to my mother, hoping against all reason that she would share my outrage. She listened quietly as I laid out the facts, then sighed and said in a voice both weary and dismissive, "Men make mistakes. She's your sister. Keep the family together." I felt the last thread of my belief in her snap. This was not a lapse in moral judgment to her. This was maintenance of the family order where Claire's desires outweighed my dignity. I hung up without another word and sat in silence until the sun went down. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls of my life close in around me. The wedding was weeks away. The invitations sent the deposits, paid the plans in motion. But the man I loved had betrayed me with the woman who had been my rival since birth, and the one person who should have defended me had instead chosen to protect them. It was in that cold and sleepless space that my resolve formed. I would not cancel quietly. I would not walk away and let them keep the narrative. If they were willing to treat my life like a story they controlled, then I would rewrite the ending in my own hand. I began sketching the outlines of a plan that would use the very tools my mother prized against her appearances, timing, and control of the moment. What they did not know yet was that I understood those tools better than anyone, because I had been surviving under their weight my entire life. The first step was information, because in my family, you could never confront a tyrant with only emotion. You had to bring facts sharp enough to cut through every denial. I met with a lawyer the following morning, a woman named Harper, who listened without interruption as I laid out the situation from the years of favoritism to the betrayal unfolding now. She asked for every detail, no matter how small, and by the end of our first meeting, we had a list of evidence to collect. I spent the next 2 weeks working as if my job depended on it because, in a way, my freedom did. I took screenshots of every message between Claire and Daniel, saving them in encrypted folders and printed copies that were time-stamped. I retrieved receipts from joint accounts showing dinners and hotel stays that had no explanation except the one I already knew. I remembered the security camera in my apartment building and requested footage of the nights they had claimed to be elsewhere but were caught on tape arriving together. The pieces began to form a picture so clear that even my mother's stubborn defense could not distort it. During this time, I kept my face neutral in public. I answered Daniel's rare attempts at contact with short, non-committal replies to keep him unaware of my next move. I did not tell friends the full story because I needed to control when and how it came out. At work, I focused on my projects with more precision than ever, as if channeling my fury into something that would keep me from breaking down. Harper and I also dug into the wedding finances and discovered that a significant portion of the fund I had contributed had been quietly redirected to cover Claire's debts. Credit card statements showed luxury purchases in her name paid with money from the joint account my mother managed for the wedding. This was the crack in their facade that made my plan bigger than exposing an affair. It became about revealing the entire pattern of exploitation. I began to think about the setting for the confrontation. It had to be somewhere they felt secure, somewhere they would never see the attack coming. A casual meeting would not do, and a public place would give them an excuse to walk away. The perfect choice came when my mother suggested a family discussion at her house to settle the tension she claimed to sense between me and Claire before the wedding. She framed it as a chance to heal and move forward, which was exactly the image I wanted her to have. I agreed immediately and began preparing the documents Harper had organized into a neat binder with tabs labeled Messages, Finances, Witness Statements, and Legal Notices. The day before the meeting, I visited my apartment one last time to rehearse what I would say. I stood in front of the mirror and practiced keeping my voice calm, no matter how high the temperature in the room rose. I imagined the look on Claire's face when she realized I had not come to plead but to prosecute. I thought about my mother's expression when she understood that the game she had been playing her whole life was about to end. This was not about revenge for its own sake, though that would be satisfying. It was about taking the power they had used to humiliate me and turning it into the tool that would dismantle their control. Every detail was accounted for from the moment I walked in to the moment I left with the last word. I slept better that night than I had in weeks because I knew the balance was about to shift, and for once it would be in my favor. My mother's invitation had been framed as an olive branch, but I knew it was really a summons designed to remind me of my place before the wedding day arrived. She wanted the scene on her turf where the walls themselves seemed to whisper her authority. On the afternoon of the meeting, I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a tailored navy suit that struck the line between professional and unyielding. I arrived at the house precisely on time, walking past the manicured hedges and the glossy front door that had once felt like the entrance to a safe place, but now looked like a gate to an arena. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and my mother's preferred vanilla candles. The living room was staged as always for appearances, decorative pillows, fluffed perfectly framed photos curated to tell a story of a harmonious family, and Claire's laughter floating in from the kitchen as if she owned the space. Daniel was there too, leaning against the counter, his voice low as he spoke to her. They both straightened when I entered, but only Claire smiled that same half-mocking curve of her mouth that had taunted me since childhood. My mother emerged from the hallway in a silk blouse and pearls, her glass of iced tea clinking softly. She greeted me as if nothing were wrong, ushering me toward the couch she had clearly chosen for me slightly lower than the armchairs where she and Claire would sit, a subtle reminder of hierarchy. I took my seat without protest because I had no intention of following the script she had prepared. She began by talking about family unity, her words wrapped in the kind of polished vagueness that avoided specifics. She spoke of misunderstandings and forgiveness, of the importance of maintaining a united front for the sake of our reputation. I listened without expression, letting her believe I was absorbing her message. Claire chimed in occasionally with little comments about how stressful wedding planning could be and how she hoped we could put everything behind us. Daniel kept his gaze on the rug, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. I noticed the way my mother's tone shifted when she addressed me soft but edged with the assumption that I would eventually yield. It was the same tone she had used when I was a child, being scolded for challenging her authority. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, casting long bars of shadow across the floor. I sat still, aware of my own heartbeat, aware of the binder in my bag beside me, and the plan ticking closer to execution. They believed this was an intervention, a chance to talk me into silence. What they did not realize was that the moment they were setting the stage for was not theirs to control. Every word my mother spoke about compromise and letting go only confirmed that she still thought I could be manipulated into protecting them from consequences. I nodded occasionally, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of how little had changed. This was her domain, and she assumed it was still mine too. Soon, that assumption would collapse. I sipped the tea she had placed in front of me without asking, tasted the faint sweetness, and set it down carefully on the coaster. The sound of the glass meeting the wood felt like a quiet punctuation mark in a conversation I was no longer willing to have on her terms. I had come here to end it, not to mend it. My mother's speech about unity rolled on in slow circles until it felt like she was trying to hypnotize me into submission. She repeated phrases like family above all, and we must think of the bigger picture, as though those words were sacred law. Claire leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, tilting her head with a look that managed to be both bored and triumphant. Daniel sat stiffly beside her on the sofa, avoiding my eyes, his hands clasped so tightly I could see the knuckles whitening. I let the silence stretch after my mother's last sentence, until even she seemed unsure if she should speak again. Then she said something that made the temperature in the room drop in my mind. She smiled faintly and said, "Just let him love you both." Her tone was maddeningly calm, as if she had just offered me a reasonable compromise rather than a grotesque suggestion. For a moment, no one moved. Claire's eyes flicked to mine, daring me to protest. Daniel's head lowered, as if hiding from the fallout. I felt my breath slow, not from shock, but from the effort of keeping my voice steady. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, word for word, without flinching. She explained that marriage was complicated, that love took many forms, and that family bonds were worth preserving, even if that meant sharing certain things. She said it like she was imparting ancient wisdom, when in reality it was just another way of telling me to accept less than I deserved, so Claire could have more. Claire's lips twitched into a smile almost imperceptible, but enough to light that familiar spark of defiance in me. I thought of every time my mother had told me to give in to let Claire win, to put the family first, when what she meant was put Claire first. This was not a new story, only the stakes had changed. I could feel their confidence in the air, the way they believed I had nowhere to go, but through the door they were holding open for me. My mother reached for her glass and took a sip as if to mark the end of the discussion. She thought her decree had been delivered and would stand unchallenged. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking suddenly loud in the quiet room, and felt the corners of my mouth lift in a smile they did not understand. I knew exactly how many seconds it would take before the front door opened and Harper would walk in. The plan was in motion, and none of them saw it coming. My mother started to say something else about how this arrangement could work for everyone, but the sound of footsteps in the hall cut her off. The footsteps grew louder on the hardwood until Harper appeared in the doorway, her leather briefcase in one hand and a stack of neatly bound documents in the other. She was dressed in a charcoal suit, her expression cool and professional, but her eyes flicked briefly to me in silent confirmation. My mother's brows knit together in confusion while Claire shifted in her seat, suddenly less comfortable than a moment ago. Daniel glanced up quickly, his eyes darting between Harper and me, as if calculating what her presence could mean. I stood slowly, smoothing my jacket and letting the silence stretch long enough for the tension to settle over the room. I said that before we discussed anything further, there were some matters that needed to be addressed. Harper stepped forward, setting the documents on the coffee table with deliberate care before taking a seat beside me. She began by stating her name and role, making it clear that she was my legal counsel. My mother blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process the intrusion into what she believed was a private family matter. I could see the flicker of unease cross her face, but she forced a smile and said there was no need for lawyers here. Harper ignored her and opened the binder to the first tab marked Messages. She slid a page across the table to my mother, then to Claire, then to Daniel. The room seemed to shrink as they read the printed screenshots of text exchanges between Claire and Daniel, complete with dates, times, and explicit details. My sister's face drained of color, and she let the page fall back onto the table. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. I told them calmly that the wedding was canceled effective immediately, and that legal action for emotional distress and breach of contract regarding shared finances was already in progress. Harper turned to the next tab labeled Finances and outlined how significant sums from the wedding fund had been diverted to cover Claire's personal debts. She placed copies of credit card statements and bank transfers in front of my mother, who stared at them as if they were written in a foreign language. I could feel my pulse steadying the way it does when you realize the moment you've been preparing for is unfolding exactly as planned. Claire tried to interrupt, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but Harper cut her off, stating that all transactions had been verified. My mother's voice rose sharp and defensive, insisting we could discuss this privately without legal interference. But Harper leaned forward and reminded her that attempts to conceal or dismiss these matters could result in further liability. I watched their confidence erode with each page turned, each fact laid bare. This was no longer the stage they controlled. I had shifted the spotlight and they were trapped in it. By the time Harper closed the binder, the room felt heavier, the air thick with the weight of what could no longer be denied. I looked at each of them in turn and said the only thing left to say: I came here to end this, not to excuse it. Claire's mouth opened and closed twice before any words came out, and when they did, they were a desperate mix of protest and self-pity. She said it was not what it looked like, that I was blowing things out of proportion, and that Daniel still loved me. I kept my eyes on her until her voice faltered, then shifted my gaze to Daniel. He muttered that it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, and that he had been confused about his feelings. I asked him if months of secret meetings and hundreds of messages sounded like confusion or commitment to someone else. He had no answer. My mother's anger finally broke through the thin shell of composure she had been trying to maintain. She accused me of humiliating the family, of turning a private matter into a spectacle. Her voice climbed in volume as she said that no one needed to know about this if I would simply agree to let it go. I told her plainly that the humiliation belonged to those who had acted without honor, not to the person exposing the truth. Harper opened the section of the binder labeled Witness Statements and read excerpts from neighbors who had seen Daniel visiting Claire's apartment late at night, and from the apartment concierge who had confirmed they often arrived together when they claimed to be elsewhere. Claire's eyes widened as each statement cut away another piece of her denial. My mother tried to dismiss the witnesses as unreliable, but Harper presented copies of security logs and building entry records. Then came the section on financial misconduct. I explained in detail how my contributions to the wedding fund had been siphoned to pay off Claire's credit card balances and cover luxury purchases in her name. I asked my mother to explain why money meant for my future had been used to prop up my sister's spending habits. She said she was protecting Claire from financial ruin, as if that were an answer that justified theft. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she saw no moral failing in what they had done, only in my refusal to accept it. I told Daniel that a civil suit for damages was already drafted and that I would be seeking repayment for every cent I had invested in the wedding and related expenses. Harper added that the affair itself, documented in explicit detail, would be central to the case. Daniel's face reddened as the reality of public exposure dawned on him. Claire turned to my mother for support, but for the first time, my mother looked at her without immediate defense. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The control she had always maintained was slipping, and she knew it. I could see it in the way her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. Harper reminded them all that attempts to retaliate or interfere could have further legal consequences. The silence that followed was the deepest I had ever heard in that room. It was the sound of power changing hands. I closed the binder and told them that from this moment forward I would not be a participant in their narrative. I would write my own, and they would live with the version they had authored for themselves through their actions. The fallout began immediately after Harper and I left the house because control had been yanked out of their hands in a single afternoon, and there was no way to stuff the truth back into the shadows. Within a week, Daniel's business partners learned of the pending lawsuit and quietly began distancing themselves. One major client pulled a lucrative contract citing reputational concerns. His phone calls to me shifted from angry to pleading, but I did not respond. My lawyer handled all communication and reminded him that any attempt to contact me directly could be considered harassment. Claire's world began to shrink as word spread through her social circle. Friends who had once tagged her in glossy brunch photos stopped inviting her out. A few even reached out to me privately to say they had suspected something but never imagined it would be confirmed so publicly. She lost a brand collaboration she had been flaunting for months when the company decided association with her name was a liability. My mother faced the harshest blow to her image because for decades she had curated a reputation of dignity and moral authority in the community. The financial misuse I had exposed became a quiet but potent piece of gossip among her peers. Invitations to charity events stopped arriving, and a woman who had once held court at every local function now found herself uncomfortably absent from them. She sold a parcel of land she had been holding as an investment to cover legal fees and part of Claire's mounting debts. In public, she wore the same confident smile, but in private, the cracks showed. I heard from a cousin that she no longer spoke about family unity and had grown quieter in conversations about Claire. For me, the days following the confrontation were a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. I packed away the wedding dress I had once chosen with such hope and donated it to a shelter that provided attire for women starting over after leaving abusive relationships. I closed the joint accounts, moved to a new apartment across the city, and took a week off work to simply exist without the constant tension that had defined my life for months. The lawsuit moved forward steadily, and within 3 months, Daniel settled out of court for the full amount I had requested plus additional damages. He signed a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from framing the story on his terms. Claire attempted to reach out once via email, offering a version of an apology that placed most of the blame on Daniel and described herself as a victim of his charm. I forwarded it to Harper, who advised me to ignore it. My mother never contacted me directly, but sent word through relatives that she thought the matter had gone far enough and that it was time to rebuild the family. I declined every overture. The boundaries I had put in place were not temporary. They were the foundation of the life I was now building without their interference. Standing in my new living room one evening, watching the city lights through the window, I realized that the satisfaction I felt was not just in winning, but in reclaiming the ground I had been pushed off of for so long. I had faced them on their terms in their territory and left with my dignity intact and theirs in pieces. The consequences they were now living with were not mine to manage or soften. They belonged to them entirely, and for the first time in my life, that truth felt like freedom. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own, free from the constant pressure of meeting expectations set by people who had never intended to see me as an equal. I began each morning with a quiet coffee on my balcony, letting the cool air remind me that the chaos I had left behind was no longer my daily reality. The calls from Harper became less frequent as the last loose ends of the legal process were tied up. Daniel's settlement cleared in full and the funds were placed in an account I controlled alone. I used a portion to pay off my student loans and invested the rest carefully, a reminder to myself that the security I valued would now come from my own decisions. Work became a place of focus and achievement again. Without the mental drain of navigating my family's toxic patterns, my productivity soared. My boss noticed and offered me a leadership role on a major project, which I accepted without hesitation. It felt like the first step in a future built entirely on my own merit. Socially, I reconnected with friends I had drifted from during my engagement. I told them parts of the story, but not all, keeping the more painful details for myself. What mattered was that they saw me now as someone who had endured and come out stronger. One evening, I attended a networking event where I met another woman who had ended an engagement under similarly painful circumstances. We spoke for hours and exchanged numbers. It was the first time in months I felt the spark of possibility without the shadow of betrayal looming overhead. My apartment slowly transformed into a reflection of the life I wanted. Bright colors, soft textures, and no reminders of the life I had left. On the wall by my desk, I hung a framed quote that read, "Sometimes you win by walking away, but sometimes you win by standing your ground and making them move." It was not about revenge anymore, though the memory of that day in my mother's living room still brought a quiet satisfaction. It was about the power of refusing to be diminished. The distance from my mother and Claire remained, and I intended to keep it that way. There were occasional holiday cards from extended family with polite mentions of how they were doing, but I did not respond. The space was necessary, and I no longer felt guilty for maintaining it. I had learned that protecting my peace was not selfish, but essential. As the first anniversary of what would have been my wedding day approached, I booked a trip to the coast alone. Standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, I thought about the version of myself who would have been married to a man who betrayed me and tied to a family who saw my worth only in what I could sacrifice. That life was gone, replaced by one where every choice was mine. I breathed in the salt air and felt lighter than I had in years. Leaving that spot, I knew that my story was no longer defined by what they had done to me, but by what I had done in response. 1 year after the confrontation, I returned to my mother's neighborhood, not to visit, but to attend a community event where my company was sponsoring a local charity for women starting over after leaving unhealthy relationships. The irony of the location was not lost on me. I passed the street where her house stood and felt no pull to turn in, no ache in my chest, just the quiet certainty that I had chosen the right path. Inside the event hall, I spoke to a group of women about resilience and the importance of protecting one's boundaries. I did not tell them the personal details, but I spoke from the place that had been forged in the fire of betrayal. As I looked around the room, I saw heads nodding and eyes glistening, and I realized that my story had shifted from being about what was taken from me to what I had reclaimed. The moments that had once defined my pain were now lessons I could use to strengthen others. After my talk, a woman approached me and said she had been told for years to accept whatever her family demanded because it was easier than fighting. She thanked me for showing her that easier is not the same as better. Driving home that evening, I thought about how far I had come since that day in my mother's living room. I no longer replayed the scene with anger, but with a kind of gratitude for the clarity it had given me. The truth had been ugly, but it had set me free. In the quiet of my apartment, I sat by the window and wrote in my journal a habit I had kept since I was a teenager. I wrote that success was not always about winning in the eyes of others, but about living a life that feels whole to you. For me, that meant no longer seeking validation from people who measured my worth against someone else's comfort. It meant choosing peace over proximity when proximity meant pain. As I closed the journal, I thought about the women in my family who might one day face their own crossroads. I hoped they would see in my choices a different blueprint, one that did not require them to shrink or to share their dignity in order to belong. My life now was not without challenges, but it was mine entirely shaped by my own decisions and values. That was the true victory, not just that I had exposed their lies or reclaimed what was taken, but that I had built something stronger in the space they left behind. To anyone listening who finds themselves in a similar place, I would say this: you do not owe anyone your silence when they have stolen your truth. Stand your ground, speak clearly, and remember that the moment you stop letting them write your story is the moment you begin to live it on your own terms.